The sun rose slowly over the parched land, spilling its amber light across the dry earth like honey over cracked porcelain. Dust clung to the air in a way that felt permanent, as if even the wind had given up on trying to sweep it clean. A sagging house stood lonely on the edge of a forgotten trail, its boards warped, its windows dull, and its silence deep enough to make the birds skip their morning songs. Eliza Monroe bent to gather the clothes she'd washed in last night's dishwater, now stiff and sun-bleached on the line. Her bare feet pressed into the warm dirt, skirts brushing her ankles, hair twisted up in a way that spoke more of duty than beauty. Her hands were red from scrubbing, her nails rimmed with a memory of soil. The scent of old cotton and sun-dried sorrow clung to her as surely as the dust to her soles. She didn't look up when the door creaked behind her. She knew the sound of her children's steps too well, light, cautious, like they feared their noise might break something fragile. Her son, Jacob, only 7, stood holding his little sister's hand. June was 4 and always had one question or another clutched in her fist like a wildflower she hadn't yet offered. "Mama, there ain't no more biscuits." "I know, baby." He didn't ask for more. He'd stopped asking since the last winter. Their pantry was a shelf with 2 cracked jars and an old tin of salt. Eliza had counted every meal in her head for the past 2 weeks, stretching scraps into something passable with enough water and heat. When the hens stopped laying, she prayed. When the cows stopped milking, she cried, quietly, after they were asleep. This land had been her husband's, though never truly. Thomas Monroe's claim was ink on paper, not roots in soil. When he died under a runaway wagon 2 years back, his kin came down like crows on a field. They took the livestock, the strong tools, the horse and cart. Said it was theirs, said a woman couldn't manage alone. Said she'd do better somewhere else. But Eliza hadn't left. Not because of pride, but because of the 2 little souls looking up at her each morning with eyes too wide for their years. Now the house groaned with heat, and the sky promised no rain. Her hands itched with doing, but there was nothing left to fix. She looked out at the fields, overgrown, lost to weeds, and wondered how much longer before they'd be driven out like coyotes from a henhouse. At midday, she walked to the neighboring ranch, 1.5 miles in stiff boots, left the children under the elm with half a jug of warm water, and her mother's locket for luck. The house she reached belonged to her brother-in-law's wife, Cora. The woman opened the door with a sigh and a look like she'd just stepped in something foul. Eliza didn't ask for charity, just a little milk for the children, maybe some flour if there was any to spare. She stood small but upright, a woman refusing to beg, though her stomach clenched like a fist. Cora looked her up and down. "You should go back to your people in Kansas, Eliza. This place ain't meant for widows with mouths to feed." The door shut softly, but it felt like a slap. She walked home slower. The sun burned the side of her face. Her shadow stretched out long, thin, tired. When she crested the last hill, she saw Jacob running up the path, wild-eyed. "June says there's a man out near the trees, just standing there." Eliza dropped the jug, and it cracked in the dirt. Her heart stuttered, the old stories rising in her chest like dust from a stampede. She reached the homestead fast, too fast for the wear in her limbs, shielded her eyes with a shaking hand, and sure enough, out beyond the cottonwoods, a figure stood. Tall, still, half-blurred by heat shimmer. She couldn't make out his face, but something in his stance said he didn't come for trouble. Just watching, like he'd been watching for a while. She ushered the children inside, barred the door, pulled the old rifle down from above the hearth, and sat at the kitchen table with it laid across her lap like a memory. The children whispered in the corner, voices low. June sucked her thumb, eyes wide. Jacob kept looking at the window, like he needed to protect her too. No knock came. No shout. Nothing moved but the wind, curling dry leaves along the porch. By sunset, the figure was gone. She let the children sleep in her bed that night, arms curled around them like a fence. Her breath was shallow, and her bones ached. But it wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was the loneliness. Later, when the moon was high and the house had settled into its nighttime creaks, she stepped outside. The stars scattered above like spilled sugar. The cottonwoods stood black against the horizon. No sign of the stranger now, just silence and the weight of tomorrow waiting. She looked up, not expecting an answer. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered, voice barely sound. "If someone's listening, please, send me anything but more silence." Her arms wrapped tight across her chest, her apron still damp from the day's sweat. Behind her, the door hung open just a crack, golden light spilling onto the porch like hope that hadn't yet gone out. From the woods, too far to see, but near enough to feel, the wind shifted. And though she wouldn't know it till later, someone had heard her. By morning, the dust lay heavy over the porch, settled into the cracks like old sorrow that wouldn't shake free. Eliza moved slow through her morning chores, body aching from a night spent half sleeping, ears tuned to every shifting branch. The stranger near the trees hadn't returned. Not that she'd seen, but the air held something different now, like a breath waiting to be exhaled. She fed the children a thin porridge made from the last of the oats, thickened with water and a scraped bit of lard. June picked at hers. Jacob ate without sound, eyes flicking toward the window like he expected something, or someone, to appear there. Eliza kept glancing too. That day passed quiet, but taut. She tended the garden, pulling weeds from rows that had long forgotten what it meant to yield. The bean stalks had dried to brittle stems. The squash vines gave up weeks ago. Only the onions clung to life, stubborn as she was. Sweat ran down her back, her fingers blistered from the hoe, and still her eyes drifted to the edge of the trees. When the smoke came, it rose soft and pale through the cottonwoods, curling into the sky like a question. She stood still, hoe clutched in her palm, the children beside her in the field. "Mama," Jacob said, almost a whisper. "I see it. Not a wildfire, no scent of burning grass. Just the thin, steady trail of someone's fire. Too close to be random, too purposeful to be anything but intentional." That night, the boy coughed once, then again, the sound sharp and tight in his throat. She felt his forehead. It burned under her palm. Her stomach dropped. June whimpered beside him, curling into the curve of her brother's spine like a kitten to heat. Eliza searched the cupboard again, though she already knew what she'd find. No quinine, no willow bark, just a square of cloth and a chipped bowl. "I'll walk," she said to herself under her breath. "I'll get help." She bundled Jacob in a blanket, laid him beside June, and kissed both their foreheads. Then she strapped on her boots, heart hammering against her ribs. It was past sundown, and the sky was already turning a dark indigo. The nearest town was 5 miles east, and she hadn't made that trip on foot since the baby was born. Still, she stepped onto the porch and kept going. The night opened around her, cicadas humming, the smell of sage stirred by the breeze. She moved fast as worn leather soles and thin limbs would carry her. Each step felt like walking through a memory, the world half familiar, half forbidding. Coyotes howled far off. A shadow passed overhead, a hawk or a ghost. When her knee buckled on the trail, she tried to rise and couldn't. Her ankle screamed. She collapsed into the dirt, the stars above suddenly much too far away. A soft rustle came from the brush. She flinched. Out from the dark stepped the figure from the cottonwoods. Closer now, clearer. A man. Cheyenne by his braids and the cut of his leather shirt. Though it wasn't the war-painted image the old folk spoke of in fear. His eyes were shadowed beneath high cheekbones. His presence didn't crackle with threat. It settled like still water. Eliza tried to sit up, breath caught between pain and uncertainty. "Please," she whispered. "My boy, he's burning." The man said nothing, but he moved to her, crouched low, and placed a hand gently beneath her arm. His strength was unforced. He lifted her with care, like she were made of brittle porcelain. No questions, no words, only action. She leaned into him, not from trust, but need. His skin smelled of smoke and earth. He shifted her weight across his shoulder and began walking, not toward town, but back toward the house. Eliza's protest died on her lips. Something about his calm was louder than fear. By the time they reached the homestead, Jacob was coughing so hard his body shook. The man laid Eliza on the porch, then slipped into the house before she could stop him. He knelt beside the child, opened a worn pouch from his belt, and began to pull dried herbs and a stone pestle from within. He moved with a kind of reverent speed. No panic, no wasted motion. Just purpose. He crushed the herbs, poured water from the tin kettle, and let them steep. The scent rose, sharp, clean, bitter. Eliza sat in the doorway, watching. June curled against her leg, thumb in her mouth, eyes fixed on the stranger with no fear, just curiosity. When the man tipped the mixture gently into Jacob's mouth, the boy winced but swallowed. Minutes passed. Then more. The coughing eased, just a little. The fever began to break in fits, sweat blooming on the child's brow. Eliza didn't speak. She couldn't. The air felt thick with something too old for words, like watching rain fall after a long drought. Finally, the man stood. She looked up at him. Her voice scraped out, hoarse and aching. Why? He didn't answer, just turned and stepped through the door. Before she could call him back, he vanished into the dark again, footsteps swallowed by the dust. She stood there a long time after, arms wrapped tight around her waist. The wind picked up. A few stars winked through the clouds above. Inside, Jacob's breathing slowed to something soft and even. June had fallen asleep curled around her mother's shawl. Eliza sat beside them, pressing her hand to her son's chest. She didn't know the man's name, didn't know what debt she owed or if she'd ever see him again. But when she closed her eyes that night, she felt something she hadn't in months. Not safety, not yet. But maybe the world had not forgotten her entirely. The morning broke cold and slow, with frost silvering the porch rail, and the sky veiled in the pale hush of dawn. Eliza stirred beneath the thin quilt. The children tangled beside her like warm vines, breathing softly. Jacob's fever had loosened its grip, leaving him flushed but calm, his small chest rising steady under her palm. She waited there, watching the sunlight inch along the floorboards, too wary to believe the danger had passed. Something in her bones didn't trust peace when it came easy. But still, her boy lived. That alone was something sacred. When she stepped outside, the frost bit her heels, and the breath caught in her lungs. But there, on the edge of the porch, stacked with the same quiet precision she remembered from long ago, was a bundle of wood, freshly chopped, tied with twine, still steaming faintly in the chill. She blinked once, twice, looked toward the cottonwoods. Nothing stirred. The smoke from that hidden fire was gone, as if it had never risen. Inside the bundle was tucked a small cloth pouch. Dried herbs, the same bitter scent that had saved her boy. She didn't cry. Not then. She just carried the wood inside, lit the stove, and held her hands over the flame like a woman who'd nearly forgotten what warmth felt like. The days that followed unspooled gently, like thread from spindle. Jacob gained color. June started humming again, tuneless little songs about birds and apples and stories her mother had once told her when life felt softer. The frost returned each night, thicker now, turning the world into a porcelain stillness each morning. And each day, something new would appear. A rabbit hanging from a porch beam, its hide clean and its eyes already closed in peace. A wedge of tanned hide folded near the woodpile. Even a jar, glass, chipped, filled with golden honey, so sweet it made June squeal and Jacob lick the spoon like it held gold. Eliza never saw who left them, but she knew. She began to leave things in return. A loaf of bread, coarse but warm. A blanket she had mended with old thread and care. One evening, she placed a note, scrawled on the back of a seed packet, resting against the stump where the rabbit had once hung. "Thank you for seeing us." No reply came, but the gifts continued. Each time she saw movement at the tree line, a shadow shifting behind the brush, a figure just out of reach, her chest tightened, not in fear, but in something else. Wonder maybe, or longing. A hunger not of the body, but of being recognized. Not pitted, not used, just seen. She thought of Thomas then, her late husband, how he used to speak to her only when he wanted something. A clean shirt, a hot meal, her silence. His presence had always filled the room like smoke, heavy and suffocating, and still she had stayed, thinking it better to be kept than cast away. But this stranger, this Cheyenne man with no name and no demand, he gave without taking, protected without asking, watched without judgment. Some days she caught her own reflection in the water barrel and paused. There was something new in her eyes. Not beauty, not yet. But softness returned, like ash stirred to life by breath. Then came the night she found him on the porch. She just finished sweeping the last of the corn husks from the floor when the knock came, barely more than the wind tapping. She opened the door, heart caught between flight and prayer, and there he was, standing in the dusk like he'd always belonged there. He didn't speak, just nodded once. She stepped aside. He sat near the edge of the porch, elbows resting on his knees, gaze turned toward the dark fields. The stars began to show, one by one, indifferent to her pounding chest. She brought 2 tin cups filled with weak coffee and sat beside him. Not close, not far, enough to feel the warmth of his body between the night chill and her thoughts. The silence stretched long and easy. He didn't look at her, and she didn't push. But after a while she said, "You saved my boy." A slow breath from him. Not agreement, not denial, just acknowledgement. She watched his profile, sharp, serene, carved from something ancient. His braids were tied with leather cord, and his boots were worn but whole. "I used to think I had to earn everything," she said softly. "Even kindness." The wind stirred the dry grass. He didn't answer, but he stayed, and that was answer enough. Jacob peeked from the window, and Eliza turned, lifting a finger to her lips. The boy grinned, a tooth missing, eyes bright. June clung to the windowsill beside him, her tiny hand pressing against the glass like she wanted to reach the stars. Inside the house, the fire crackled. Beside her, the stranger finally spoke. His voice was low, shaped by another tongue beneath the English. "Boy strong. He'll run with the spring." Eliza turned toward him. "And the winter?" A pause. Then, "He will not break." She swallowed. That lump in her throat had lived there for years. When he stood to leave, she rose too. "Will you come back?" He met her gaze, and in it she saw no heat, no plea, just something quiet and true. "If you leave the lantern burning." And with that, he walked into the trees. That night, she lit the lantern, hung it on the porch, high and steady. Then she sat by the window with the children curled against her side, the fire low, her eyes fixed on the cottonwoods beyond. She didn't know what would come, but for the first time in a long while, she knew she wasn't waiting alone. The air turned mean just before noon. It wasn't in the sky, clear and blue without apology, but in the stillness that clung to the fields, as though even the wind had stepped back, watching. Eliza stood on the porch with a basket of fresh-washed linens, arms trembling just enough for the fabric to flutter. She looked down the road, that long dry stretch of dirt that had once brought only hard news. And today it brought riders. Dust rose behind 3 horses. She saw them before she heard them, their outlines too familiar, like old bruises flaring up in sunlight. Men in worn coats, their shadows long and unwanted. She didn't move, just pressed her lips into a line and folded the last towel with more care than was needed. Jacob peeked through the window. "Mama, I see them." She stepped off the porch. June stood barefoot on the edge of the garden, hair in 2 messy braids. Eliza met her daughter's gaze and gave a single nod. The child understood, ran inside without being told. The horses came to a stop just past the broken fence. The lead rider dismounted, his boots hitting the earth like claims. Walter Monroe, her late husband's older brother, bore a face like stone left in the sun too long, cracked, hard, and bitter. The other 2, one a cousin, the other a man she didn't know, stayed mounted, reins loose, expressions already drawn with contempt. Walter didn't bother with a greeting. "Word is you've been playing house with a savage." Eliza kept her voice even. Word travels farther than truth. His lip curled. "You think you can sit out here like queen of nothing, raising bastard children on Monroe land?" Her spine stiffened. "This isn't your land. It was never yours." Walter stepped forward, eyes glinting like nails. "Thomas died. You weren't kin. We let you stay out of pity." But now you've brought shame to the name. You got people in town whispering about a red man sneaking into your bed." She flushed, not with guilt but fury. "That man saved your nephew's life, fed your brother's children when you left them with nothing but dust. The cousin spit into the dirt. Doesn't make him clean." Eliza glanced toward the trees, the cottonwoods still and silent. No sign of Tasani. No sound but the breath of her own resolve rising in her throat. "You need to leave," she said. "There's nothing for you here." Walter laughed, the kind that didn't reach the lungs. "That house is mine by law. I'll have the sheriff here come Friday. You'll be out by sundown, woman, or you'll be carried." They turned, reins snapping, hooves pounding back down the trail. Dust bloomed where they passed, as if the earth itself recoiled. Eliza stood alone, face stun red with heat and shame, fists tight at her sides. The house door opened. Jacob stood there, jaw clenched like a man too young for such weight. "You ain't leaving, are you?" "No," she said. "Not this time." That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the trees. The lantern flickered on the porch, casting a golden ring of safety she no longer trusted. The knock came quiet, like always. She opened the door before he could turn away. Tasani stood under the stars, the wind tugging his coat. His eyes found hers, calm but alert. He could see the change in her. "They came today," she said. "Said they'd return with law." He nodded once, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Eliza stepped aside, and he entered without hesitation. Inside, the house smelled of cedar smoke and bread. The children slept in the corner, unaware of the storm creeping closer. She sat at the table, the old ledger between them. Thomas's name, the land title, all the inked lies that men use to carve up the world. Tasani looked at it, then looked outside, where his people's ghosts still walked. "It was your land before any of us," she whispered. He didn't answer, but his silence said what history never had time for. It still is. He stood then, slow, deliberate. From beneath his coat, he drew out a folded cloth, weathered and creased. He laid it on the table. Inside, tribal markings, drawn on hide, old and fading. Boundaries, rivers, camps, trails. The land, this land, marked before it was ever sold, stolen, or claimed in ink. Eliza touched the edge of the hide. "Will it matter?" "Only if we show it does." She looked at him, saw the stillness in his eyes, the strength that didn't shout. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from something gentler. Trust. The fire crackled. The lantern swayed in the wind. They sat together as the night deepened, not touching, not speaking more than needed, but side by side nonetheless. And when she finally laid her head down near the children, her fingers still brushing the edge of the old tribal map, she didn't dream of fleeing. She dreamed of standing. The lantern burned through until dawn. The storm didn't announce itself with thunder or wind. It began with silence, the kind that settles too deep, as if the land itself has gone still to brace. Eliza rose before first light, her hands already moving before her mind caught up. She boiled water, wiped the table, tucked the children's blankets tighter, all while the weight in her chest thickened, solid and unshakable. By midday, the sheriff arrived. He didn't knock, just sat atop his horse, coat buttoned up to the throat, eyes dull as river stone. Beside him stood Walter Monroe, his boots clean, his mouth curled in triumph. The sheriff cleared his throat like he didn't want to be here. Walter didn't bother with pretense. "You've had your time," he called. "The law says this land goes back to the Monroe estate." Eliza stepped out slowly, children peering from the doorway behind her. Her hair was pinned, her apron crisp despite the dust. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. "There's more than one law," she said quietly. Walter scoffed, but the sheriff raised a hand. "She's right. I got your note. And the paper." From inside her blouse, Eliza drew the folded hide Tasani had given her. The map, the tribal claims, the hand-marked lines passed down generations. She stepped forward and offered it to the sheriff, her hand steady. This land was taken. Long before Thomas, long before Monroe. It was never rightly claimed. The sheriff studied it, his brow pulling tight. He wasn't a cruel man, just tired, just used to the world bending the way it always had. But there was something in Eliza's eyes, something old and rooted, that made him pause. Walter growled, "You gonna take the word of a widow and a savage over legal deed?" "I'm gonna take my time," the sheriff muttered. "Which means no one's moving today." He turned his horse and rode back down the trail without another word. Walter stayed behind. "You think you can shame me? Parade around with some dirt-born stray and call it justice?" Eliza didn't flinch. "You left 2 children to starve. You turned your back when they cried." Walter's face darkened, his pride bleeding through like a bad wound. "You think you're better than us, Eliza? You think you can play wife to a red man and still stand in this town?" A voice answered before she could. "He is not her husband." Tasani stepped from the trees, silent as ever, walking slow but certain, each footfall soft on the dry grass. The children gasped. June reached for the doorframe. Jacob stepped outside, his face bright, brave. "But he is family." Tasani walked until he stood beside Eliza, not touching, not crowding. Just there, like stone, like sky, the kind of presence that doesn't need to be explained. Walter's lip curled. "You gonna kill me, savage?" "No." The word fell quiet, final. "I don't need to." Behind them, the sound of more horses came. Not many, but enough. 3 riders, then 5. Then more. Townsfolk. A handful of ranchers, a schoolteacher, the old widow with her cane and the voice of steel. They came quiet, some dismounting, some standing, watching. "I seen her walk to town with nothing," the widow said, voice shaking but loud. "And not once asked for help." "I seen her boy near dead," another murmured. "And that man," he nodded to Tasani, "brought him back. I seen her live decent. Better than most of us ever tried." One by one, voices rose, not loud, not fiery, just true, like water breaking through dam stones. Walter turned red. "You think you can scare me with a few cowards?" Tasani stepped forward, and for the first time, something in Walter pulled back. Not fear of violence, but of something deeper, of irrelevance, of being outnumbered by truth. "You can leave now," Eliza said. Walter looked to the crowd, to the trees, to the porch where Jacob now stood with his sister's hand in his. Then he spat, turned, and mounted his horse. "This ain't the end." He rode off into the dust. No one watched him go. Eliza's breath left her all at once. She didn't know she'd been holding it. Her knees nearly buckled, but a hand steadied her, Tasani's, firm at her elbow. Not possessive, just present. The townsfolk murmured their goodbyes and drifted back into the prairie, like leaves after a storm. That night, the lantern burned without wind. Inside, the children laughed for the first time in what felt like years. Jacob raced June around the table, the 2 of them tumbling over each other, wild with relief. Eliza stood at the stove, the kettle, singing low. "You didn't have to come," she said softly. Tasani sat beside the hearth, sharpening a small knife with slow, steady strokes. "I said I would," he answered. She turned, her fingers fidgeting with her apron tie. "You said if the lantern burned." He looked up. Their eyes met, and in the quiet between them, something settled. Not passion, not fire, but something gentler, a kind of knowing. "You could stay," she said. He didn't answer, just rose, walked to the door, and looked out over the fields. The moon hung low, heavy with light. The porch creaked beneath his feet. "I lost many things," he said finally. "A name, a family, a place." Eliza stepped beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "So did I." He turned to her then, not quite a smile on his face, but something warmer than silence. He reached into his coat and pulled out a carved figure, a small wooden hawk. He handed it to her. "For the boy," he said, "to remember." She took it gently, the smooth wood warming in her palm. "He'll never forget." He looked to the stars, then down to her. "And you?" She smiled, quiet, real. "I remember everything." Behind them, the children called her name. She turned once more toward the sound of home, and he stayed.